This is JCT TV. This is Bible study for the 21st century. Welcome, friends. We're going to be getting into our Bible study in just a few minutes, but I'm going to be introducing Rita Guild to you. She works with us in our overseas missions work called WOW, Working for Orphans and Widows. We've been doing this now for 20 years, working with the least of these, with the most vulnerable, the most fragile orphans and widows impacted by HIV and AIDS and other opportunistic infections. Rita's been working with us for 14 years in various capacities. We're going to be talking with Rita and also showing some pics from my most recent trip to Africa. Don't miss it.
JCT TV is the official voice of WOW, Working for Orphans and Widows. Jim Cantelon is the founder of WOW and has been ministering to orphans and widows in distress for 18 years. WOW's focus is home-based care for the dying. The horizon is vast, with thousands of the least of these in Africa and India. WOW depends on your generous support. To do so, simply contact us by phone, mail, or online.
Now, friends, you've been hearing me for a few months now talking about JCT, Jim Cantelon today, as the official voice of WOW, Working for Orphans and Widows. This is a ministry to orphans and widows that my wife and I established 20 years ago because of the ravages of HIV and AIDS, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, with the weakest link, with the most vulnerable of all people, and that is, in any culture, orphans and widows. And I thought, I should take some time over the course of 4 programs to give you more of an exposure to what we're doing overseas. And that will help you to understand why, without any apology, I say, if you can support this ministry, please do it. Rita Guild has been working with us for 14 years. Rita has been very, very faithful in so many aspects of the ministry. One of them being in what we call monitoring evaluation. As you know, when you're dealing with donor dollars, you're dealing with money that otherwise would be going in taxes to the government. The government allows this, but they also want you to be accountable. And in order to be accountable, you not only have to have annual reports, financial reports, but you also have to show that you're doing what's called monitoring and evaluating. You're going onto the field and you're taking a look at how those donor dollars are being applied. And you're evaluating the success or failure of those applied funds. And this is something that has to happen. And so 2-3 times a year, it's required that we be there on the ground with the various partners with whom we are in relationship to make assessment and then to have, a kind of a paper report in case we're asked for it. And we're, of course, obligated to do this, and we're happy to do it. Well, Rita has been very involved in M&E, but now she is mainly involved in the direction of our various operations in this ministry to orphans and widows, not just in Africa now, but also in India. And so I've asked Rita to come in, and while we're talking, we're also going to be taking a look at some pictures that my wife Kathy and I just took a few weeks ago when we were on one of our monitoring and evaluation trips. So it should be most interesting, and you're going to enjoy it. First of all, Rita, thanks for coming our way. You joined us about 14 years ago, and I didn't know you from Adam. I think you heard me preaching in a church somewhere. But tell me how it all came about.
I had been attending People's Church for quite some time, and I'd heard you speak a few times,
Right.
actually, but there was one time that you spoke that things just really resonated with me. I was looking at what it meant to be a Christian, and at the time you were talking about right relationship with God, right relationship with man. And that was the part that was missing from my understanding or my experience of Christianity. And so at that time, I was this super shy girl who wanted to just stand up and say, what this guy is saying is right. So having heard that, I went home and thought about it. And I had at that time also been volunteering at People's, looking at where can we get more involved as a donor. I felt the responsibility of starting to know where were our funds going, and do you just freely give it away blindly? There is a time for that, but in my heart, it was time to figure out what was happening with our funds. And that's around the same time that you spoke. And I asked if we could connect and just hear more about, at the time, Vision Led, which is now working for Orphans and Widows. Right. So yeah, that's how we got to know each other.
Yeah, I remember we had lunch, and you expressed your heart for this, and it seemed to me that the Lord was really doing something in your life. And of course he was, and he is, and you've been so involved now for 14 years. When you look at the ministry now as when you first began with us 14 years ago, have you seen some change, some development? And I know that's sort of a leading question, but from your perspective.
Yeah, change in two different ways. Yeah. The first way, the most obvious, and the reason I'm still here after 14 years, is I've seen development on the ground. I've seen people's lives change drastically, spiritually, emotionally, physically, in every way I've seen changes. And it's been encouraging and like an incredible blessing to be able to go over 2-3 times a year and be able to see what's happening on the ground and follow communities, follow families, follow children over time. So I've seen that. I've also seen WOW change from where we started to growing, expanding the work that we do, to coming back to exactly where we were when we began, which to me is also incredibly exciting.
Yeah, and where we began really, friends, and just in case you're wondering, was with 2 scriptures. First of all, Psalm 68, verse 5, where David tells us that God is a father to the fatherless and a defender of widows. And the other being James 1:27, where he says, true religion and undefiled, or the kind of religion that God endorses, is to visit orphans and widows in their distress and keep oneself unspotted from the world. Visiting orphans and widows in their distress, seeking justice. Keeping oneself unspotted from the world, declaring and living righteously. So, on that basis, we've found now in 20 years, a whole universe of opportunity and need emerge, and it's getting bigger and bigger all the time, and the Lord has been faithfully supplying the need. Now, I brought some pictures, Rita, and they're in no special order, but I just want to walk you through some of this, and I'm doing this, of course, for your sake, viewer, because you've not had the exposure that Rita's had or that I've had, but some of these pictures might give you a little insight. Now, okay, this shot here is a kind of an innocuous picture. What's that all about? Looks like a fence. Yes, it is. What we're doing here is we're just about to walk into a notorious slum on the outside of the northeast edge of Johannesburg, South Africa. Let's see the next one. Walking in, of course, you can see that it's anything but a modern subdivision. It's the most basic. People use whatever they can to construct some kind of a domicile. And they even use bed springs, as a fence, anything to kind of mitigate the impact of thieves and others who would want to take advantage of, especially of orphans and widows who have no one to defend them. So again, you walk into a place like this, and the average, South African would never dare to walk in here. And I'm not such a courageous guy, but I figure this is where the Lord wants us to be, so away we go. Let's take a look at the next pic. And this one gives you a little insight into what I saw to the left of me as I walked in. You see, it's just sort of random shacks with bits of wire, whatever they can find, surrounding them to help, discourage some of the rapists and thieves and home breakers that, take advantage of helpless orphans and widows. But again, these are the living conditions. This is not some kind of a park, that's made to look like an impoverished area. This is life day in and day out for these precious people. Let's just, Rita, coming back to you for a minute. You've been in many difficult situations. You've seen slums. You've seen the humble rondavels, as they're called, these mud huts with the grass roofs and so on. I, for one, and Kathy, my wife, would share this, can never really get used to it. It's hard to imagine how some people live on a day-to-day basis. I almost feel sometimes like we're from a parallel universe coming there out of the West.
That is how it feels.
Yeah.
And you're right, you don't become immune to it. It's so shocking, the conditions that some people are living in. You just can't become cold to it or used to it.
No. You see this next pic here. This is a shot from the road, all right? That's where we were. That's where we were walking. Now, this is all in South Africa. We're going to get to Zambia, and we're also going to get to Malawi here over the course of the next 4 programs. But this is the reality. You see the trash that's burning there on the right side of the picture. There's a constant acrid smell of burning rubbish. And then you have the constant smell of charcoal smoke, because people are using charcoal to cook food. And those tarpaulins there on the left side of the picture, they're not just there for temporary use. Those are, if you can call it permanent, those are permanent walls of somebody's little space where they live. And keep in mind, friends, and Rita, this is something that you and I know very, very well. These are people with brains. These are people with hearts. These are people with souls. These are people with relationships with their children. They have, all of the human needs that we have. But their life is so adversarial compared to ours. Coming back to North America, I sometimes wonder at the pettiness of some of our concerns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's hard not to be angry, but I learned that I have to be as ready to adjust to my own culture as I am ready to adjust to their culture. Otherwise, I think it would just drive you nuts.
Yeah, there's a reverse cultural shock, which you're probably in again. You're in it every time you come home.
Yeah, Kathy and I have just got over our jet lag, and here we are, on television. This shot here, friends, this is, and again, these pictures are in no particular order. We're just sitting down together in your living room and looking at a little bit of a slideshow here. A couple little boys came up to me. We had just come into what's called a peri-urban area outside of Lilongwe, Malawi, and we're quite an attraction, with our white skin, and in my case, with my my beard and my bald head, and they've never quite seen anybody like me, and Kathy, who's a total blonde, and so we tend to attract them. We either frighten them or attract them. Sometimes they run away screaming because they've been told that we are boogeymen, and we've come to steal them away. But everywhere you go in Africa, friends, there are children. I don't know what the latest stat is, but I think 50% or maybe a bit more of Africa's population are under the age of 15.
It's a huge number of younger people that are there that have grown up without parents, a large part of them. And so who's teaching them their morals and values and
who's protecting them? Who's being a father to the fatherless? Who's defending those widows? Who is visiting them in their distress? This is what we're trying to do with working for orphans and widows, and this is why I want you to know about it. And over the course of the next several programs, I'll be giving you more insights with Rita, more pictures, and I'm sure that you'll not only find it enjoyable, informative, but also challenging.
Jim Cantelon Today is a program dedicated to the teaching of the good news of Jesus Christ. This all through the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. JCT also brings to you encouraging testimonies and stories from Christian leaders all over the globe. If this program has added value to your life, would you please consider becoming a partner? To do so, simply contact us by phone, mail, or online.
You know, friends, I do my best in the short amount of time that a television program provides to give you a kind of an overview of the Gospels. We spent well over a year and a half in the book of Matthew, and now we're in the book of Mark. I'm also writing what's called Cantelon's Casual Commentary at the same time and making it available to you if you want it for your benefit. I've released it in this kind of a format because it'll fit in a pocket or in an envelope when we send it out to you, or tuck it in your Bible. This is chapters 1 through 9 of Mark, and then the second booklet with the rest of Mark is coming out in a few months' time. But I want you to have it. So all you got to do, we show the coordinates, the phone number, the mailing address, and also the website 3 or 4 times every show. Mark it down, and you can connect with us and ask for your copy of Cantelon's Casual Commentary, Book of Mark. If you don't have Matthew, well, there they are, all 4 of them in booklets that together comprise a small book on the Gospel of Matthew. And I'll just be delighted to send it to you. And if you should choose, I'm still jet lagged from my trip to Africa. If you should choose to do so, we really invite your support, because you're supporting not only this program, but also the work we're doing overseas with WOW, working for Orphans and Widows. Okay, let's get to Mark chapter 1. Now, last time I had got to verse 17, where Jesus had already begun to call disciples, and he had been walking by the Sea of Galilee and called Simon and Andrew, his brother, who were both fishermen, to join him. And by the way, I should say this, it wasn't uncommon in Jesus' day for various leaders, zealots, rabbis, self-appointed prophets, to have disciples. It was a very common phenomenon in Jesus' day. And for him to be calling men to follow him was, de rigueur. That's what you did in those days. If you had any kind of a prominent message for the people, you would have followers. In Jesus' case, he had more than enough followers. You go through the Gospels and you see at times there was as many as 50,000 people cramming in on him. At one point, Luke says, trampling on each other. The crowd was so huge. But the point being that it wasn't uncommon to have disciples. What happens, and we'll see this with Jesus' disciples, is that he ends up with, in some cases, hundreds, if not thousands, following him around. But he's got this inner group of disciples called the 12. And within the 12, there was another group called the 3, Peter, James, and John, who joined Jesus for very special moments, like the Mount of Transfiguration, like the Garden of Gethsemane. The word disciple had common meaning in those days, not so common these days. Disciple, by the way, comes from a root which means to discipline. And Jesus, if you will, disciplined his followers with his teachings. Anyway, that's another topic. Okay, so let's pick it up in verse 18. They immediately left their nets and followed him. And when he had gone a little further from there, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, John, his brother, who were also in the boat, mending their nets. Immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and went after him. Then they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and taught. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Now there is an awful lot in those few verses. First of all, why the willingness to follow Jesus, do you suppose? Why would Peter and Andrew and James and John so readily drop their nets and follow him? Obviously, they'd had some exposure to Jesus. Andrew certainly had had exposure to Jesus. On one occasion, John the Baptist, in Andrew's presence, pointed at Jesus who was walking by and said, "Behold the Lamb of God." And it's very possible that Andrew had some interaction with Jesus. Andrew had probably talked to his brother Peter about Jesus. They were probably intrigued with him. The whole event at the baptism, with the voice from heaven and the dove, and "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." All of this had a mounting sort of momentum in terms of the public view of Jesus. So you can be sure this wasn't a cold call that Jesus was making here. There was some, at least beginnings of a relational dynamic there. And so they were willing to follow him. They'd seen enough to be convinced that Jesus was more than your average zealot or rabbi. Same thing with James and John, sons of Zebedee. Zebedee must have been a little shocked. His boys just get up and leave, and leaves him, holding the nets. It seems to be rather sudden, but they did it. And the rest of Jesus' disciples, by the way, are mentioned a little later on in chapter 3, verses 13 and 19. Okay. In verse 21, it says, they went into Capernaum. Now, try to picture this with me. The Sea of Galilee, I think I've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating, is not really what you and I would call a sea, especially for those of us who live in North America. It's a lake. It's maybe 12 kilometers long and 6 kilometers wide. It's really just a small little pond compared to the Great Lakes, for instance, that are shared by the USA and Canada. You fly over much of the northern states, much over northern Canada, and you look down from the plane, you wonder if there's more land or more water. In North America, it's just full of tens of thousands of lakes, and most of them are bigger than the Sea of Galilee, okay, just for perspective. But in terms of this little sand lot that the scripture refers to as Palestine, and later we know as Israel, this one lake was it. We had the Dead Sea, which was a body of water, but it was absolutely dead because it was so salty. You had the Jordan River, but apart from the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River, there was a kind of a swampy lake in Jesus' time north of the Sea of Galilee, up in the upper Galilee, called the Hula Lake in the Hula Valley, but it was more of a swamp than a lake. And when the state of modern Israel was formed back in the late 40s, that swampy lake was drained, and it's no longer a lake. It's very verdant. There's lots of farmers there, a lot of fields there, and beautiful things being grown. But really, this little pond, the Sea of Galilee, was it. And until recently in modern Israel, it was the only source of fresh water, apart from some groundwater along the coastal plain from Caesarea up to Haifa. But over time, that groundwater began to yield because so much was being drawn from it for Tel Aviv and Haifa, especially, and Caesarea. And so Israel was facing a water crisis during the years that I lived there in the 1980s. And then in the 90s and the early 2000s, it became very severe. And so Israel has developed some very unique desalination technology, and they now are no longer dependent on the Sea of Galilee as they have been throughout their history. Anyhow, this was the lake, full of fish. And on the northern shore of the lake is Capernaum, still there. The ruins of Capernaum are still there. And for those of you who've been there, I've been there scores of times over the 7 years I lived in Israel. It's a beautiful ruins, lovely remains of an old synagogue and other evidences of housing. And there's trees and olive presses. It's gorgeous, right there on the northern shore. This became Jesus' adopted ministry center. He was from Nazareth. That's where he grew up, even though he was born in Bethlehem. But now he made Capernaum basically his ministry hometown. And the Bible doesn't use the term boarded, but that's essentially what he did. Jesus boarded with Peter and Andrew in their home there, right on the edge of the sea. And you can still visit a kind of a chapel that was built over the ruins of Peter and Andrew's house. And quite likely it's original. It's pretty much the spot right there, just maybe 50 yards or so up from the water. Capernaum is gorgeous, but it was a cosmopolitan area. Capernaum was right on the trade routes from east to west. There were all kinds of camel caravans going through all of the time, people from various nations, all kinds of languages being spoken, people of various kinds of racial extraction. to the point where it may have been the epicenter of the Galilee that was referred to in Isaiah as Galilee of the Gentiles. It really was more of a Gentile city than a Jewish city. And it kind of, foreshadowed what would happen with the gospel of Jesus Christ. From the beginning, we know now, in Jesus' ministry and also in what happened in church history, the Gentiles were always the plan. Jesus was Jewish, the apostles were Jewish, everything was Jewish-based, but the whole point of God's plan was out of Israel to bless the world with the gospel of hope in Christ. And Capernaum was sort of the starting point of a ministry that eventually reached out not just to Galilee of the Gentiles, but to the Gentile world. That kind of sets it up. We'll pick it up next time.
The Bible tells us that true religion is visiting orphans and widows in their distress. The Bible also says that God is a father to the fatherless and a defender of widows. Heaven's core values for mankind begin with God's heart for the least of these. When you support WOW, you're in the sweet spot of God's heart for the poor. Yes, we're only a small player in this great drama, but at least we're on the field. Please give generously.
I hope you enjoyed the little bit of exposure we gave you to working for Orphans and Widows with Rita Guild, who works for us. She'll be on the program the next three shows, God willing, and we'll be able to give you some more insights into the work that we're doing overseas. I want you to know that JCT and WOW are like this. I mean, founded by Kath, my wife, and I, with a view to not only declaring the gospel, but also to living the gospel, with an emphasis on both righteousness and justice, father to the fatherless, defender of widows, visiting orphans and widows in their distress. What we're doing overseas is just as much a part of what we're doing right here in the studio. And your support is critical. That's a no-brainer. It goes without saying. Please support this ministry. And the coordinates are always there in the program. You can write them down. And ask for your copy of Cantelon's Casual Commentary. The first half of the book of Mark is out right now just for you.